Hey, it's Martine. Before we get going with today's show, I have a quick note. So we're getting into that part of the election season where there's just a lot of news. And of course, that has felt particularly acute now with President Biden's campaign and the continued questions about the future of his candidacy. We are not covering that on today's Post Reports. But our politics podcast, The Campaign Moment, has cooked up a fresh episode out today on all the latest, including the House Democrats now publicly and privately calling for the president to step aside. My colleague Aaron Blake has a fascinating, in-depth conversation with White House reporter Matt Pfizer, who's been behind the scenes with a very frustrated President Biden during the last few days of his media blitz. You are definitely going to want to take a listen to that conversation. So right now, find The Campaign Moment in your podcast app, hit follow, and look out for that episode. All right, now let's start today's Post Reports. So, Rick Nowak, I don't think I have to tell you that things here in the States have been a little crazy and politically complicated of late. But it sounds like the same is true over there in France. Not only is the country about to host the Summer Olympics, but there was also a huge election over the weekend. So as one of our correspondents currently based in Paris, what is your sense of the mood right now?
Well, this summer was always expected to be turbulent in France. The country was preparing to host the Olympics. That was always going to be difficult. But then last month, President Emmanuel Macron really surprised, I'd say, everyone, including some of his closest allies, when he called snap legislative elections.
De notre Constitution. J'ai décidé de vous redonner le choix de notre avenir parlementaire par le vote. Je dissous donc ce soir.
Really throwing the entire country's politics into turmoil just weeks before millions of people are going to head to Paris for the Olympic Games.
Now, after yesterday's dramatic runoff, the political picture in France remains complicated. A week ago, in the first round of voting, Macron's party suffered major losses. His grip on domestic politics appeared to be coming apart, and it looked like France's nationalist anti-immigration party might be headed for a win. It would have meant France's first far-right government since Nazi occupation in World War II.
Well, what we saw last night was really surprising in many ways. I think we all expected that the far right would come in first in this election, that it would gain more seats than any other party, that it might fall short of an outright majority, so might not be able to form a government, but that it would make historic gains. What we saw instead yesterday was the left leading, then Macron's party gaining a surprising number of seats, and the far right only coming in third. So that really was a stunning result, led to a lot of celebration on the left and among some centrist supporters of Macron.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, July 8th. Today, we are talking with our correspondent, Rick Nowak, to unpack this pivotal moment in France. Later in the conversation, you'll hear us discuss preparations for the Olympics, whether the city of Paris is actually ready, whether long-distance swimmers are actually going to be swimming in the Seine. But first, we're going to hear more about Sunday's election. So, Rick, for people that aren't familiar with the French parliamentary system, can you just sort of explain, how do their elections work?
Well, usually you have a presidential election that results in the president being elected. And that happened for the last time 2 years ago when Macron was reelected for a second term, which is constitutionally his last. These presidential elections are usually then followed a few weeks later by parliamentary elections that decide the composition of the lower house of parliament, the Assemblée nationale, which is the really powerful parliamentary chamber. Usually, this happens every 5 years, but we are now in a situation where Macron has called snap elections that were not scheduled. He called them because he felt the need to have a stronger mandate to be able to govern. These elections, these parliamentary elections, happen in two rounds. The first round we had 2 weekends ago, and the final results were announced after the second round this Sunday.
So Emmanuel Macron has been the president of France since 2017. What have the politics been like inside France during his time in office? And how did that lead him to calling this snap election at this strange moment because it's happening right before the Olympics?
Well, I covered his victory in 2017 here in France.
Merci, mes amis. Merci d'être là, de vous être battus avec courage et bienveillance.
And at the time, Macron was seen as a modernizer, as a new force in politics, someone who could really change the country for the better, who might be able to take on the far right, to diminish their chances of ever winning the presidency, really. 7 years on, there is not much left of this initial enthusiasm. When you talk to people here on the streets, I've struggled to find anyone who has anything good to say about Macron. A lot of people think that he's responsible for the situation the country is in, for the political gridlock, for the polarization of politics. To some extent, a lot of analysts I speak to say that this is unfair. The country is doing relatively well if you compare it to other countries in Europe. But there is a deep sentiment, I would say, among voters that things are not headed the right way. They talk about immigration, about insecurity, and they think that something needs to change.
And why is it that the National Rally Party, this far-right party, has been getting so much traction? Like, what are the things that people are concerned about that they think that this party could have helped with?
Well, the far right has, over the past years, tried to portray itself as a party that's capable of governing, of really being a mainstream force in politics. And it has tried to portray itself as the only alternative that voters have not tried so far, which in some ways is true. There has always been this Republican front, parties rallying against the far right when it came to it, uniting to prevent a far right victory. And the far right now says that this has prevented them from ever showing what they're capable of. They are saying that they would be a party that would spend heavily on poorer people, that they would help people who are disadvantaged, that they would stop migration, so that French people would get more money, more services, better services. Over the past weeks, I spoke to a wide range of voters in France, and one of them was Bruno Rodriguez, a 61-year-old retiree in the city of Creil, to the north of Paris.
Mais pourquoi Macron il soutient
Parce que Monsieur Macron, c'est un jeune, c'est un banquier, n'est-ce pas? Il est que pour les riches.
He said that he voted for the far right because he feels that Macron's government has only helped the rich but not the poor. In some ways, the proposals of the far-right National Rally Party aren't that different from the far left. They want to really spend heavily, redistribute money from rich people to the middle classes, to poorer people. That's their appeal in a lot of rural areas, a lot of rural towns and villages in France. But at the same time, the party still does have a lot of its proposals that for a long time made it an outcast of French politics. For example, it wants to prioritize French people over foreigners for certain state services, for welfare, for healthcare. It would also want to privatize the public broadcasting system in France, which is seen as an attack on press freedom.
And so, given this threat from the right that President Macron was facing, why did he decide to call an election now? I mean, it seems like it wouldn't be your instinct. at a vulnerable moment to say this is the time when we want people to come out and decide for themselves in the polls whether they actually want me in office or not.
You're right. It was very counterintuitive. In early June, the EU held parliamentary elections for the European Parliament. That's a very separate entity from the French National Parliament. And in these European elections, the far right, the French far right, came out on top. It was a major defeat for Macron's alliance. But usually, these European elections have very limited impact on national politics. They're seen as quite removed from, what's really happening in French politics. This time, it was different. Within hours of that vote, of that European vote, Macron gave a speech saying, "This is it. I'm dissolving parliament. I need a stronger mandate. This needs to change. We cannot have a situation where the far right is seen as the top political force in this country." So that's what he did. He called national parliamentary elections, really stunning even some of his own allies who spoke to me, and some of them said this was an irrational decision. They don't understand why he did this. He did not have to do this. There is no constitutional need for him to call a parliamentary election in France as a result of a European elections defeat.
But as you said, in the first round of voting, the far right, the National Rally Party, actually did quite well, better than a lot of people expected. And it seemed like that was a moment that people really thought, like, maybe this party is going to be our future. Why do you think that they did so well, and why do you think Macron did so poorly in that initial round of voting?
Well, the far right did well for a number of reasons. First of all, the issues that they've been talking about, inflation, purchasing power, migration, the polls showed that these are issues that have been far more important over the past few months than they were a few years ago. So something has changed about the topics that voters in France prioritize. But at the same time, I think there was also just widespread frustration with the political status quo in France. The government that Macron oversaw that had raised the retirement age a year ago, really pushed it through Parliament.
Tonight, fires across France. One protester telling us this is a war. Hundreds of thousands taking to the streets, outraged over French President Emmanuel Macron's unyielding determination to reform pensions here.
I think a lot of people wanted change, and they wanted to punish Macron for his policies.
So then that initial election happened 2 weekends ago. And after the first round of voting, the way that the French election system works, there's a runoff. What were the machinations behind the scenes in preparation for this runoff? And how did President Macron try to play defense here?
I think parties were quite shocked by the results of the first round of voting a week ago. It seemed clear that the far right has a path to a real majority in parliament that would enable it to name a prime minister, to form a government. And that really changed, I think, the calculus for both the left and the center. Macron's allies and the left do not agree on many things, but they do agree on the need to keep the far right out of power. So what they did was they withdrew candidates in races where 3 candidates advanced into the second round. And that increased the chances of moderate candidates to win against the far right. And that's what we saw play out yesterday.
So it sounds like they were basically strategic in pulling out certain candidates in an attempt to try to coalesce support behind either the center party or the left party, trying to unite to provide a stronger defense against the far right.
That's exactly right. And it was not easy for Macron's camp or for the far left to do that. They had Macron at times portrayed the far left as equally dangerous to the country as the far right in recent weeks. But in the end, Macron and his allies did throw their support behind the left. And that really did make quite a strong difference in this race.
And tell me about the results and the reaction to those results, especially from Marine Le Pen and the far right. I mean, it seemed like for this period, they thought that this was going to be a big win for them. And clearly it was a disappointing result.
This really was a shock, I think, to the far right yesterday. And when you watch videos of the reactions at what was supposed to become an election night party for the far right, you can see that quite clearly. Really shocked silence, some people even crying there. They had hoped that this would be the final step of transforming the really fringe far-right group that was formed decades ago into a mainstream political movement in France. That did not happen. It's very clear that French voters united against the far right. They still see them, or at least a majority of voters see them, as political outcasts.
I wonder, is there a case to make here that Macron's plan worked? That ultimately, even though it seems kind of dicey in the middle for the center and for the left, that they kind of got what they wanted, which was a show of support and veering away from the far right?
Well, it worked in a sense that Macron now looks better than he did after the first round a week ago. But his bloc, his alliance, still suffered significant losses compared to the last elections 2 years ago. And when he called snap elections, he said he wanted a clear mandate to govern. What he got was a mandate that is essentially gone. So I don't think that thinking of this as a major victory for Macron's gamble really works.
So what happens going forward? Yes, the far right didn't win outright, but it seems like the political outlook here is a little complicated because there's going to have to be power sharing in the future. What does that mean and what does that look like?
It's going to be extremely complicated. Some people even think there is no historical precedent for this. Macron essentially now has the power to name the next prime minister, but there still needs to be a majority for that prime minister in parliament. Otherwise, the next government will immediately collapse. What the left is now saying is that they should form the next government, that they should have a chance to essentially name the next prime minister because they came in first. The problem with that is that their bloc is still about 100 seats away from a majority. So there really isn't a viable path to a government that won't immediately collapse for the left. Some are talking about the possibility of a broad alliance, that would bring together Macron's allies, the center-right, or what's left of it, and moderate forces in the left. This is something a lot of European countries are very accustomed to. This is would be very normal, for example, in Germany. But France does not have that political system. It does not have that political culture of consensus building. So it doesn't seem likely that such a broad alliance would survive. And if it did, it might actually frustrate voters to an extent that they might vote for the far right next time.
All right, so let's take a pause there. And after the break, we're going to talk about what all of this political uncertainty could mean for the Olympics. We'll be right back. Okay, so the Olympics are a little over 2 weeks away. And obviously, I think a lot of us here in the States who are excited about watching, we want to know, will the results of this election have any effect on the Olympics itself? And maybe it won't have any effects. But also, is this going to affect the French government's ability to represent France on the international stage at this critical moment in a united way?
Well, Emmanuel Macron is expected to head to Washington on Wednesday to participate in the NATO summit there. So he still is expected, and he's also able to represent France on an international stage. He might be weakened, and there might be questions about how much power he still has to shape policies, but he is still the president and will remain so until 2027 unless he steps down. In terms of the Olympics, things are a little more complicated. And the outgoing Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, he hinted at that yesterday in his speech.
Notre pays connaît une situation politique sans précédent et se prépare à accueillir le monde dans quelques semaines.
Saying France, is preparing to host the world and there needs to be stability. He offered to continue on as prime minister over the next few days or weeks to steer the country through this. And this morning, President Macron accepted that offer. So Gabriel Attal will remain in office for the time being. And I think what the French government is trying to convey to people who are heading to France over the next few weeks is that this is a country that is still run by a government, is still run by someone who knows what he is doing and who has been involved in preparing for the Olympics for months.
I also wonder if there's something symbolic here, right? That, as you were saying, this election really represented France grappling with complicated ideas of French national identity and a France for French people. And I feel like a lot of that brushes up against what the Olympics means, which is, sort of this opportunity to embrace the multiculturalism. And is there a sense that the case that France is making of how it wants it to present itself to the world is a little bit more complicated because of these complicated election results?
Absolutely. I spent some time over the past months in Ile-Saint-Denis, which is a town to the north of Paris. It's very poor, extremely high poverty rate. It's long been really ignored by politicians in France, but only over the past few years has that changed. And people there told me it's changed because of the Olympics. A lot of the Olympic venues, the athletes' village, for example, are in the proximity of that town. So they've really seen projects being finished or started that they couldn't even dream of, things that they never were able to secure money for. So the Olympics have had a positive impact in areas of Paris that in the past were often forgotten. I think there is now obviously a fear that the message that the government of France, but also the city government wanted to send with these decisions, that they're trying to be more inclusive, that they're trying to address some of these problems. That this would change if the far right continues to surge in the future or to gain more seats.
And generally, how are Parisians feeling about the Olympics being in their city? You described that one community where you got a chance to talk to those residents who sounded like they were kind of excited about the fact that all this infrastructure had been built where they lived and that they saw something positive in that. But I mean, are you getting a more complicated picture when you zoom out of people who don't think that all of this investment is necessarily good for them?
I think opinions are very divided. The Olympic Games are really one of the most divisive issues here in the city. I've spoken to people who are really frustrated with certain things. Social workers in Paris are particularly concerned about reports that homeless people and people living in squats have been moved by the authorities in the lead up to the Olympic Games, have essentially been pushed out of the city center. The social workers that I've been talking to say that this really has a profound impact, especially for families without a home. It takes children out of their schools, for example, cuts healthcare access for their parents, and has really been strongly criticized by a lot of NGOs here in the city.
But is the city ready? And I will say I've seen a lot of headlines over the past year about this question of the Seine, the big river in Paris, and whether it will be clean enough for athletes to actually swim in it, which they're supposed to do. Like, is it going to happen? Like, are these generally, is the preparedness there, and specifically is the river ready for these swimmers?
The mayor of Paris was supposed to swim in the Seine a few days ago. She said she had to postpone that because of the elections.
Oh, sure.
Now, we don't know. We don't know if that was the real reason, because pollution remains relatively high in that river, even though the city and the government of France really spent billions over many years to clean it up. So there are quite a lot of unknowns for these Olympics, and one must say that the organizers, they risked quite a bit with how they set up these games. The opening ceremony has usually been hosted in stadiums. This time it's going to be a floating parade down the Seine with hundreds of thousands of spectators sitting on the riverbanks. Obviously, this looks probably spectacular on television, but it does pose a lot of risks, including security and safety risks.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because I know there are concerns about potential acts of terrorism. I mean, this is a moment where we're seeing a lot of conflict geopolitically when it comes to the war in Ukraine, when it comes to Israel's invasion of Gaza. I think people are wondering, is there a chance that something could pop off during these Olympics? So what are you seeing in terms of that aspect of security going into these Olympics?
Well, one terrorism analyst I spoke to said that he absolutely would not want to be the person organizing these Olympics. It's happening, as you said, at a very difficult time. There are mounting concerns, especially about groups like ISK, the ISIS branch in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that has been behind a growing number of global attacks. And the Olympics are almost the ideal target for terrorists. It's a global event. The whole world will be watching the opening ceremony, especially. So the French security services have been very aware of this, and I think they're also very concerned about it. I think they've been trying to do everything they can. They're screening up to 1 million people in advance, residents who live near Olympic sites, but also even athletes and coaches, to really minimize the risk. But ultimately, this is a major event spread out not just across Paris, but across France, really. So I think it's going to be very hard to really make sure that there is 100% protection.
So what are the questions that you have going forward, looking at the next few weeks, both in terms of the Olympics and can Paris and France pull this off, but also this election and the intersection between politics and this very high-profile global event?
Well, I think in terms of politics, the key question now is who's going to be able to form a government? Will there be a new prime minister in place by the time the Olympic Games begin? Which party will that person represent? Which political bloc will that person represent? And will France be able to escape the kind of political chaos that analysts are currently predicting? Obviously, if French politics enters a period of turmoil over the next few days, that could have implications for the Olympic Games, a major event that really will test France's ability, to be open to the world, but also to show that it can still be this grand nation that all parties agree it once was.
Rick, thank you so much for unpacking all of this with me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Rick Nowak is an international correspondent for The Post, currently based in Paris. Before we wrap today's show, here's some news that I've got my eye on. Hurricane Beryl is finally a hurricane no more. On Monday morning, Beryl made landfall in southeast Texas, pounding the Houston area with intense winds and rain, even as it was being downgraded to a tropical storm. Now it's a moment to think about the impact this storm had. It killed at least 10 people, cut a path of destruction through the Caribbean. Some of the smaller islands that make up Grenada and St. Vincent and the Grenadines were totally devastated. But what's further alarmed meteorologists about Beryl is all the records it set. The strongest storm to ever form in June, the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record in the Atlantic Ocean, one of the fastest intensifying storms in any month, going from a tropical depression to a Category 4 in 48 hours. Scientists, of course, are attributing this to climate change and record warm water temperatures in the tropical Atlantic. And this kind of early season hurricane activity in the area is a strong predictor of a large tally of tropical storms by late fall. Also today, President Biden called into Morning Joe on MSNBC. This was Biden's second interview since his stumbling debate performance against Donald Trump nearly 2 weeks ago. Since then, more and more Democrats within Biden's own party have come forward to ask him to end his re-election bid. But in this interview this morning, Biden remained defiant.
The bottom line here is that we're not going anywhere. I am not going anywhere. I wouldn't be running if I didn't absolutely believe that I am the best candidate to beat Donald Trump in 2024. We had a Democratic nominating process where the voters spoke clearly. I won 14 million of those votes, etc.
Biden also dared Democrats to run against him and to challenge him at the Democratic National Convention in August. There's a lot more to unpack from that Morning Joe interview. And again, the best way to get caught up on the latest is to check out our newest episode of The Campaign Moment. You don't want to miss it, so go right now and follow The Campaign Moment in your podcast app. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick with assistance from Ali Bianco. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Ted Muldoon. Thanks also to Marisa Bellack. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.